All right, so today we're going deep, really deep into some declassified documents. You know, the kind that makes you go, what's going on here?
Yeah, this stuff is right out of the Mary Farrell Foundation collection at the National Archives. Juicy stuff.
A memorandum,
Mhm.
specifically, dated January 29th, 1964. And, well, Lee Harvey Oswald is at the heart of it.
Oh, and to make things even more interesting, you've brought along a CIA document too, November 15th, 1974. It's all about something called the 201 system.
Right, right. And that system, we'll get to that. But first, let's unpack some of these connections from the 64 memo. It's like a web, really. Individuals linked to Oswald, maybe even to the CIA, all swirling around the time before and after the assassination.
We're talking primary sources here, direct insights. That's what we're after.
Okay, so right off the bat, Abram Chase pops up. He's the State Department's legal advisor, bigwig, you know.
Oh.
And the memo points to a newspaper column that basically says Chase was one of the two main guys responsible for letting Oswald back into the U.S. from the Soviet Union. June 1962, that was.
Huge responsibility, right? I mean, we're talking about a defector here.
Yeah, then the memo names the other person, too. Marilyn Murphy, U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time. Plus, a Samuel Wise, counsel at the American Embassy in Moscow. Seems like Oswald's return wasn't exactly a low-profile affair.
Lots of high-level folks involved. And it gets even more curious when you think about the whole intelligence scene back then, you know, Cold War and all that.
This is where it gets good. The memo says Chase had security approval to talk to J. Foster Collins, Office of the Chief of the Court Action Staff. That's where Collins was. February 1961, that's when it started.
So way before Oswald even came back.
And get this, his clearance was a blanket request, like all access. To discuss, you ready for this? NSC 54122 matters. On a need-to-know basis, of course.
Wait, NSC 54122, that's the National Security Council directive, right? The one about covert operations.
Bingo. So we're not talking about parking tickets here. Chase was dealing with some seriously top-secret stuff, and it makes you think, was Oswald's return just a legal thing? Or was there something more to it?
I mean, blanket clearance for covert ops discussions, that's not your everyday legal advice.
Oh, and there's more. A White House name check request for Chase's wife, Antonia, Tony for short, listed as, wait for it, handler.
Handler, like in the spy sense?
You got it.
Yeah.
Usually means someone who manages agents or sources. Now, why would the wife of the State Department's legal advisor, the guy involved in Oswald's return, be flagged like that? Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
It's a bit of a head-scratcher for sure. Handler, that's not a term you throw around lightly, especially in a White House security check.
And then, March 1962, Chase's liaison clearance with CA continues. His direct contact, Archibald Roosevelt Jr.
CA? You mean CIA? Clandestine services.
You know it. So we got the State Department's legal advisor, cleared for top-secret covert ops talk, a wife possibly in the spy game, and direct contact with the CIA's undercover folks. It's like well, you get the picture.
It's a lot of dots to connect. Definitely suggests something more than just routine cooperation between the State Department and the CIA. It makes you wonder what they were really up to.
Absolutely. Now, the memo switches gears a bit. It mentions a report from February 10th, 1962, from Human Events. And Representative Francis E. Walter, he's the one raising a ruckus. House Committee on Un-American Activities, that's his turf.
Oh, Walter. He was always worried about communists under every rock. What was he on about this time?
Passports, of all things. He wasn't happy with the State Department's new passport regulations. Said they'd basically let people who were denied passports before, specifically Reds, he said, access the FBI, the CIA, all those confidential files. Thought it was a security risk.
Interesting. So a concern about protecting intelligence from those deemed subversive. Sounds like classic Cold War paranoia.
And Walter, he points the finger right at Chase. Says he's the man behind these regulations. The report gives us a bit of Chase background, too. Kennedy appointee, Harvard professor, worked with Chester Bowles back when he was governor of Connecticut. You know, trying to paint a picture of him, I guess.
It's like Walter was trying to say, this guy Chase, he's dangerous. He's putting our national security at risk.
Yeah, and Walter, he was so fired up, he even said he was going to try and change those passport rules himself. Remedy them, he called it. Real Cold War tension there, you know.
Absolutely. The fear of communist infiltration was palpable back then. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about Samuel Wise. We mentioned him earlier, the counsel at the American Embassy in Moscow involved in Oswald's return.
Yeah, him. And the memo, it connects him to something really intriguing. It says he may well be Samuel Griffin Wise, Jr., with a specific number attached, you know, like a file number. And then the memo drops this, SD and SSD, probably State Department and some kind of security classification. And the kicker, apparently was once a contract employee on A-Active.
Hold on, A-Active? That was a CIA program, wasn't it? The one that handled counterintelligence and defectors?
So the guy helping Oswald get back, maybe he had a history with a CIA program focused on, well, defectors. Makes you think, doesn't it?
It's a pretty big coincidence if it's not the same guy.
And the memo goes on. It says the State Department looked into Wise's file way back in June 1954. Then, September 1962 rolls around, and guess what? Samuel G. Wise is the second secretary at the American Embassy in Moscow. Same time Oswald wants to come back to the U.S.
So someone with a possible CIA past is right there, in a position to handle Oswald's case. That's quite a thought.
And here's the real clincher. Wise, he sends a cable to the State Department, and he says, and I quote, Davis's case is very similar to that of Oswald, and he, like Oswald, lived in the Soviet Union for 2 years after his defection and prior to making application for return to the United States. Direct comparison right there.
Wow. So there's another defector, Davis, who followed a similar path as Oswald, and Wise is pointing it out. Who was this Davis? What happened in their case? Was it a success story, a failure, or maybe a warning sign they missed with Oswald?
It's like they had a playbook for dealing with defectors, and they were checking it against Oswald's case. Pretty interesting, huh?
Very interesting. Okay, let's shift gears again. We need to talk about William Gravilla Munsell. Number #61693NL, that's his identifier in the memo.
Munsell.
Ah, right. Wise mentioned him as a friend back in '59 when the CIA was looking into whether to hire Munsell. So another connection between Wise and someone on the CIA's radar.
And the details about Munsell's CIA vetting are pretty telling. Seems his landlord in D.C., back in '52, was the only person this informant knew who was actually friendly with Munsell. Makes you think, was he a loner, or was he being careful about who he got close to?
Right. My memo even gives his address, 4421 Pernal Hall. Specific, isn't it?
Yeah, but here's the big thing. June 1952, Munsell gets denied for CIA work. Security disapproval, they called it. Why? Because from '49 to '51, he was hanging out with some folks at Denver University, and those folks, well, their loyalty was questionable, according to the memo.
Red flags right there. But wait, it doesn't end there. November 1954, Munsell pops up again. This time, a project called Fafal Live is interested in him. They're thinking of sending him to Dhahran, Saudi Arabia. So even with a security ding, they still saw something in him. Interesting.
Yeah, but the request gets pulled back. Why? Munsell himself tells them about that black mark on his record. So he knew he had a problem, but he was still willing to work with them.
That's a curious detail. Okay,
Yeah.
back to Wise for a moment. The memo mentions he went to Scarsdale High School in New York from '51 to '54. And guess what? Some citizens group accused the school of having communist influences. Plus, Wise had other questionable associates, not just Munsell.
So the guy helping Oswald, he's got his own baggage. A high school with potential communist ties, friends who raise eyebrows with the CIA. You can see why someone might take a second look at Wise and his role in all of this.
Oh, absolutely. It paints a picture of his world, the kind of circles he moved in. And in those days, that kind of stuff mattered. A lot.
Okay, ready to tackle the second document, the one from '74.
Lay it on me.
All right, so this is about the CIA's 201 system. It's basically their system for keeping tabs on people they find interesting, shall we say.
Like a big file cabinet of persons of interest. More like a super organized, maybe even computerized file cabinet. They'd identify someone, categorize them, and then boom, all the info they had on that person would go into this system.
So who were these interesting people?
The document says it was a pretty exclusive club, thankfully. The CIA's clandestine services, they were the ones picking out these folks. And it had to be someone they were actively, operationally interested in, not just someone they bumped into at the supermarket.
Right. Like actual spies or people they were maybe thinking of recruiting?
Exactly. The document specifically mentions potential agents, sources, folks involved in groups that were on the CIA's radar. And they didn't just keep a casual eye on these people. We're talking extensive reporting, counterintelligence investigations, the whole 9 yards.
So how do they keep track of all this information? Sounds like it could get messy.
That's where the 201 number comes in, or sometimes an IDN number. Every person they were tracking, they got one of these numbers. Think of it like a social security number for spies.
So each number, it had all their files, their history, everything.
Everything. It was all centralized under that number. And get this, they didn't just use it for filing. They'd use it in reports, communications, even instead of the person's real name sometimes. Streamlined, efficient, the CIA way.
Wow. So they were really serious about keeping tabs on these folks.
Oh, yeah. They even had these machine listings, like early computer databases to keep everyone up to date, field stations, headquarters desks. Everyone knew who they were supposed to be watching.
And was it just, confirmed spies or agents who got into the system?
Not necessarily. The document says they realized they should also be tracking people who were connected to those key targets, even if they weren't, full-blown agents themselves.
So, like, guilt by association.
In a way, yeah, it was about building a bigger picture. They give the example of Cuban exiles. Lots of CIA stations were keeping an eye on them, their movements, their affiliations, and they realized it would be easier to share all that information if they had a way to link it all together, probably through this 201 system.
So even if you weren't a spy yourself, if you knew the wrong people, you could end up in the CIA's database.
That's the gist of it. It was about connections, understanding the web of relationships, who knew who was influencing who.
And that brings us back to Oswald. Defected to the Soviet Union, came back, had all these interesting connections. Do you think he would have been someone they'd want to track in a system like that?
I think it's highly likely. He definitely ticked a lot of boxes. Defector, connections to potentially subversive groups, activities that might have raised red flags. Even if he wasn't a CIA asset himself, he was moving in circles that would have been of interest.
So putting it all together, what do we learn from these two documents? We've got State Department involvement in Oswald's return, high-ranking officials with security clearances and possible CIA ties, handler wife, a parallel defector case, and then this whole system for tracking individuals of interest, their connections, their activities.
It's a lot to digest, and it raises a lot of questions. What was the extent of Che's involvement? Was he just following orders, or was he a key player in something bigger? What about Davis and the similarities Wise pointed out? And Munsell, what was the CIA's interest in him, and how did that tie into Wise and Oswald?
Yeah, it's like we've got a few puzzle pieces, but we're still missing most of the picture. And that's the thing about these declassified documents, isn't it? They give you a glimpse, but they also leave you wanting more.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we're just scratching the surface here. There are so many more documents out there in the Mary Farrell Foundation collection at the National Archives waiting to be uncovered, analyzed, debated.
And that's what makes this so fascinating, right? It's an ongoing investigation, a quest for truth, a journey into the shadows of history.
And it's a journey that everyone can participate in. The more we dig, the more we learn, the closer we get to understanding what really happened. So for those of you listening, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, keep digging.
Yeah.
You never know what you might find.
Well said. All right, folks, that's our deep dive for today. We hope you found it as intriguing as we did. Until next time, stay curious and keep searching for those hidden truths.